So welcome to this session on cross-border trade. So my name is Håkan Thyr. I'm Strategic Partnerships Director for EMEA for ChannelAdvisor. And what that means is that I manage our relationships with the major marketplaces around Europe. And that's one of the perks of that is I get to spend a lot of time with customers and partners to figure out how we can help our sellers to get access to more and more digital channels. And 30 seconds about me. So as you probably figured, I've crossed a few borders. I'm Swedish originally. I've spent my formative years in the US, which is why I have this silly accent. I've been in the UK for 13 years, which is long enough to not only understand cricket, but to bowl a reasonable fastball, which is a dying art in this country, judging by recent results. All right, enough about that. So I like to start my presentations with this scary picture. So this is obviously intentionally complicated, just kind of give you an illustration of how complex things are out there. So I started my endeavors in e-commerce over here somewhere. So 1999, I launched my first e-commerce site. Things were much easier then. You got a good domain name, you built the site, you make sure you were registered in all the important search engines like Alta Vista and InfoSeek. If you guys remember those, then you're old like I am. Google was just barely starting to matter. Things were pretty easy. We didn't actually sell much, but at least it wasn't complicated. Clearly things have changed, right? So this illustrates complexity kind of on two layers or two axes. So you have a technical complexity in that you have multiple channels where there used to be only direct. Now we have obviously marketplaces. Search is tremendously important. You have social, all these things that are layers. And on top of that, you have the geographical complexity in that all these channels apply differently in different geographies. And it gets to be very complicated. So click the right button. How do you deal with that? So from a very high level, what we're going to talk about is how do you decide how to optimize your resources. You have a limited set of resources. There are only so many hours in a day. So where are you going to spend your time and effort? So this is kind of one way of looking at it is where is the opportunity compared to the complexity. So if you're in the UK is going to be a pretty good place to start. China is a huge opportunity, but it's also tremendously complex to get into and to deal with. So maybe that's not where you want to start. So we're going to talk about what we've seen. So we've been doing this for a decade now, helping sellers go across borders. So we've seen a lot of what works and what doesn't. So what we've created is the idea of a framework that we're calling the Agile Cbt Framework on how to do this and minimize the risk and investment. Now, if you look at it, how this has been done traditionally, and if you're in software development, this is kind of the waterfall approach. You start over on the left and you invest a whole lot of money. You build a new website in each country. You spend money on PPC and marketing, and if you're lucky, you actually sell something down the line, right? It could work, and it has worked. I'm not saying it's doomed to fail, but what I am saying is that if it does fail, it will be a drawn-out, costly, career-limiting failure. It's one of these up-in-flame type of things because you put a lot of investment into something that may or may not work. So especially if you're coming from a software background, the Agile approach is kind of the prevalent approach for projects these days. So the fundamental idea of Agile is take small steps, fail fast, learn, move on. And that is essentially what we're suggesting that you do in your approach to cross-border trade as well. The benefits obviously is there's a much smaller investment up front, and you may not have as much revenue, but you will have it earlier, and it will build up, and you will quickly have your revenue surpass your investment. And it's a good way of de-risking your expansion. You'll probably end up in the same place, but at a much lower risk. So if we look at how this applies to cross-border trade, we talk about 4 distinct stages. So passive CBT is where you simply make it possible for cross-border buyers to buy from you in your local market. So you're listing on local marketplaces and you make it possible to ship abroad. You look at the traffic, make sure they have a better experience. You can provide possibly Euro pricing for your European buyers. You're still shipping from your home market, so it's not, you don't need a huge logistics network for this. You're still fulfilling from here. Probably not going to be a huge driver of revenue, but on the other hand, it's a low investment and it's a great opportunity to learn. Next step is to actively sell abroad. So you start listing on marketplaces, and at this point is kind of where we see the real value of marketplaces, because it's such an easy way to get into a new market and such a low risk way, because it's an existing market. It's got the traffic that you couldn't possibly generate anyway, and it's a quick way to see what works for you in that market. So list on local marketplaces. Initially probably ship from home, but look for fulfillment in market to be able to reduce your times. And this is also obviously where things like translation and localization starts to come in. And then once you've kind of figured out how to do that, then that's when you should be taking that step on to actually building a local site. Initially probably a lighter one, but eventually a full-fledged version where you've gotten to that point where you're trying to do with a waterfall method, but you've gotten there with a much lower risk and probably with a lower investment as well. So obviously all sellers are different and unique, but the challenges broadly are not. So there are a few typical challenges that you will come across at every stage of this process. So in the passive, shipping will definitely be something you need to sort out, because if you haven't shipped abroad before, you need to find a solution that can support that. How do you deal with returns? Because there will be returns, definitely. How do you provide customer service in 11 European languages, or however many countries you choose to sell to? And then at this point, possibly the most important one is how do you deal with tax issues, legal, VAT, that kind of thing. And that will continue to be a challenge as you move through this. When you come into the active stages, okay, so I'm starting to list abroad, but what products do I put there? Do I put my entire catalog up there? Do I do bestsellers? What do I do? How do you handle payments? In Germany, for example, people like to pay by invoice, which is something that you've never come across in the UK. So there will be payment challenges to look at as well. And then finally, how do you price abroad? So do you just simply use the same pricing, or how do you figure that one out? And then as you move into having localized sites, you need to start thinking seriously about how do you handle logistics. When you've gotten to that kind of scale, you need to be shipping locally. And you're essentially, at this point, you're duplicating your UK efforts abroad. So how do you handle marketing? How do you do brand building? How do you drive traffic to your new site? So a couple of kind of number slides. This is a PayPal study that basically looks at for people who buy across borders, so cross-border buyers, where do they like to go? And this is good news if you're a UK seller, because it's the second most popular place to go for people to buy, and it's, I guess English is a strong language online, so that makes sense. Germany is close second in Europe, so that's also a good place to be. As you move into the active stage, this is a slide I pulled together from, this is over 200 sellers selling out of the UK into the 4 major European markets. And I'm sorry, it's busy, it'll get a little bit clearer. So what this shows you is who buys what where. So the 4 colors of the bars are the countries. So the obvious one is that Germany is huge. Germany is a massive market. And France is big. It's not as big, but it is a big CBT market. And in terms of the categories, the top 5 ones, the very tall one on the left is fashion, essentially. Then you have toys and games. Lawn and garden showed up much higher than I had anticipated. So that was interesting learning. Sports and outdoor equipment is very popular abroad as well. And then consumer electronics, not surprisingly, shows up. And I should say that there is some sort of, some degree of selection bias in here, and that obviously there may be some categories where we have a lot of sellers, which will skew these numbers. So don't take this as the gospel truth. This reflects our seller base. So just over the last year, we've launched probably a couple of hundred sellers across borders, and we worked with, I don't know if you've been to the eBay sessions. They've run a program where they have helped sellers by translating 500 of their listings into 4 different markets. It's the IAP International Acceleration Program, and we launched about 100 sellers on that. So we had a tremendous year in terms of learning what works on cross-border trade. And so what I've done is I've pulled together some of the anecdotes from that year of learning, if you will, and we're going to step through each one of these phases and talk about what are some of the challenges and how have our customers approached that. And since I am the partnership guy, I will also kind of signpost you towards partners who are upstairs today that you can go up and have a chat about specific challenges. All right, so passive CBT, first of all, these were the ones we looked at. So if we start with shipping, we had one seller that is actually a US seller selling into here that, first of all, obviously you need to make sure that you're packing better, possibly if you're going to ship across the ocean, but also make sure that you're thinking about dimensions, because a lot of shipping is charged on size as well as weight. So they actually had a separate packing line where they cut down their standard boxes to a smaller size, just to reduce the volume of what they shipped abroad. And they saved a significant chunk on shipping that way. Think about what you are going to sell abroad. Fragile items are probably not the best thing. I share an anecdote from my early days. I'm going to write a book on like e-commerce, how not to do e-commerce, because that was what I started. We sold French arts and crafts into the US, including outdoor vases this big in porcelain. That's not what you want to be selling online. So yeah, think about things that are fragile. Obviously things that are things like flammables, explosives. So even if your marketplace allows you to sell them, you may not be able to ship them, and that's a bad thing. We've had one seller get perilously close to being suspended on eBay, I think, in Italy, because they had several packages mysteriously just disappear. They got to the border and then just vanished. So what they had to do is they had to start tracking everything to make sure that stuff actually got to where it should go. And so that's something that I'm not saying you need to do that for everywhere or for everything, but think about, should you be tracking into certain countries or over a certain value to make sure that the things actually shows up. Returns, also a very fascinating topic. Obviously, you need to have a returns policy, but you also need to be ready to be flexible, because you're going to get return issues that you probably hadn't anticipated, and it's very important that you make sure that you meet customer requirements there. One way that we had a few sellers solve the return from abroad is, rather than accept the return, they offer a partial refund. So they say, I'm sorry you're not happy with the product, how about if we give you 25% discount? So they might end up with the buyer ends up with a sweater that they are not that excited about, but excited enough, and they get 25% back and everyone's happy. And of course, for the seller, that's less of a cost than dealing with a return. So that's one option you might want to think about. I find it incredibly fascinating, the regional differences in Europe in return rates. So we ran some numbers on one of our fashion sellers for last month. Their French return rates were 18%. Their German return rates were 64%. So it's, and it kind of makes sense if you look at how German e-commerce evolved. So it grew out of the catalog business where that's just how things worked. You ordered a bunch of stuff, you tried it on, and you sent it back. So it's not that Germans are difficult or anything like that. It's just culturally how they do distance trade. So just be ready for that. Germans will return a lot more stuff. And there was an interesting interview in one of the German papers with the CEO of Zalando last week, and they asked him about their returns policy, which is free returns and no questions asked. And what he said was, someone who buys a sweater and doesn't return it, and compare that person to someone who buys 3 sweaters and returns 2, the second person is much more likely to come back next week and buy something else. So they actually see the buyers who return a lot being more profitable. So they see that as a customer engagement rather than a pain in the neck. So try to look at it as a positive thing. Fraud, you're going to come across it. Obviously, make sure that you're checking. You should have some sort of fraud detection in place, but you might want to check yourself as well. So things like, does the billing and shipping address match, or if the billing address is in the US and the order comes from Cambodia, then yeah, and if the IP address is something else. Those are the kind of things to keep an eye on. And there's nothing saying you have to sell everywhere, right? So if there are countries that you feel are a fraud risk, then you don't have to sell there. So just don't. And I'm not going to tell you what they are. You can easily find that online. And one of the things that we learned from one of our sellers was a quick way of checking if a transaction is potentially fraudulent is they simply ask for a bit more information. So what they would do is, either through chat or whatever, they would ask for, what is the customer service number on the back of your credit card? Now, if this is someone if it's a stolen card, they're not going to have it and they're just going to go away. So, and if they give you the number and you're still not certain, you can simply call up the number and verify with the credit card company that it is a valid card and it hasn't been stolen or anything like that. So a very quick and easy way for customer service to kind of weed out the fraudulent transactions. So tax, one of these unavoidable things. And we are, by no stretch of the imagination, tax professionals. Get help early. We have partners upstairs, there you go, that can help you out. So go up and have a chat with them. It's one of those things you want to solve before you really start trading abroad, because that can get very complicated very quickly. All right, so we're moving on to active CBT. So we're now actively listing in multiple markets. So let's see this is where it gets interesting, because marketing have changed these slides since I sent it to them. So this is a new experience for all of us. These are some examples of what we support in terms of marketplaces. So these are the ones that we support in the US. You've probably heard of most of them. Obviously, Mercado Libre is the dominant one in Brazil. Here's what we have in Europe. It's a growing number. So we talked about France. I need to call out Cdiscount there, because you probably haven't seen that logo up here before. So one of the new ones that we're adding. And yeah, All You Need, which used to be Mein Paket. So. And then, of course, there's APAC, where there's a lot of things going on. We're working with Tmall and AliExpress as well. So. TradeMe is another interesting one. Small market, very suitable for English sellers to do cross-border trade. So what are you going to list abroad? So first of all, if you follow the process, you will have a lot of good data from your passive CBT, right? So you know what's been selling in what country. So if you've been doing this for a while, and if you've had a reasonable amount of transactions, you should know what's popular where. And so failing that, it's always a good starting point to start with your UK top sellers and see what takes off. Again, there are cultural differences, and some things will sell and some things won't, but you have the analytics to quickly learn what works. If you're using FBA, which is a good thing to do if you're in FBA countries, is make sure you take those costs into consideration. You probably don't want to send your long tail products via FBA because probably not that cost efficient. We recommend that you price your items so that the additional fulfillment cost is built into the price, because I think as a seller you would rather know the price and see a small fee for the transaction for the shipping than the other way around, because it just looks dodgy. And obviously if you're using both FBA and FBM, which is an acronym that we throw around, which means fulfillment by merchant, basically you do it yourself. We have the tools to toggle between the two depending on what's most profitable for you. Translation, very important obviously. It's a lot easier if you start with a native language country, so which is why obviously US and New Zealand, Australia makes a lot of sense for a UK seller. Once you move on to non-native countries, strongly recommend, unless you have a lot of native speakers sitting around with nothing to do other than translating your listings, get help, right? And there's a mix of different providers out there. Here are a few of the ones that we work with. Intercultural Elements or Web Interpret are upstairs, so you can swing by and talk to them. And there are different levels of automation of this, so you can either fully machine translate, fully manually translate, and you probably want to do a mix of that depending on the margins of your products, right? So you don't need to manually translate your long tail probably, because that's not a good use of your money. And I think I said, yeah, use an expert and verify. So we've had some interesting translations. There was one seller selling into Germany, selling sports equipment, and the machine translation took the English, and I'm guessing it said synthetic or something, like it's made of synthetic materials. And in German, it proudly announced repeatedly that it was made of fake material, and which was a little bit confusing for the buyers, and they very politely asked what they mean by fake material. So we had to fix that. So machine translation has come a long way. It's good, but you probably want to verify as well. So yeah, pricing, again, it comes back to your research and knowing your market. So look at what your price point is at. There may be suppliers that have similar products at a much lower price, and maybe those aren't the ones that you want to be sending. And make sure that you include additional costs. So for example, if you have that extra packing line, make sure that that's in your pricing model so that you don't end up selling a bunch of stuff at a loss. Currency fluctuations is one of these interesting things. You can adjust for that automatically in the platform. If you want to get rid of the uncertainty of that, you can always buy into a fixed exchange rate for a period of time. And the guys from World First are upstairs if you want to talk to them about how you can deal with kind of de-risking currency fluctuations. Duties. So as you start moving outside the EU, there are various emerging markets where it gets complex pretty quickly. And you'll get things like people buying a gift for themselves, which is technically illegal in most countries. So just don't do that, because it may get you into trouble, because it's the idea that if it's a gift, then I don't pay tax on it, or I don't pay duty, but just stay away from that. One thing to look for, and this is a trend we've seen over the last year, is the concept of cross-border trading marketplaces. So you have, essentially it's like eBay's global shipping is essentially that. So what these marketplaces will do is they will act as a UK buyer. So you as a seller you ship to a UK warehouse, they consolidate the shipping and ship it to some other market where they take care of all the logistics. So you will see, so Yuhu, it's actually pronounced Yuhu, is from North America into South America. Avenue 51 does UK to China via Tmall, and Bay One is launching in May. They do fashion from UK into South Africa, and those are all regions that have a lot of red tape involved, and so these marketplaces serve as a very good way of dipping your toe into emerging markets and to see if it's a market that's possibly right for you, so you can take more investment into that. Customer service. And as you know, marketplaces are largely based on seller ratings. Like if you don't have a strong seller rating, that will come back to haunt you. So providing excellent service in new countries is very important, and it's also very challenging. And again, you probably don't have a lot of staff sitting around speaking Mandarin and Croatian or whatever. So how do you solve that? Well, there are some marketplaces where the demands for translation isn't as high, so you can use email and Google Translate and do customer service that way. If you want to sell on, for example, La Redoute in France, they require you to have a French phone number and a French person answering the phone. So that's kind of a challenge for a lot of our sellers. So what I would say there is, again, talk to our partners. I know Intercultural Elements have a service whereby they will essentially be your outsourced customer service at a very impressive rate. Very, very good deal. And again, make sure that you respond quickly. I would say treat your foreign customers arguably even better than your UK ones, because you need to build up that rating, that reputation. So now we're moving into the full site. At this point, think about how are you going to build a brand. So how are you going to drive traffic to the site? How are you going to build brand awareness? What is your agency strategy? Are you using an agency here? Do they have a presence in these countries, or do you need to find a new one? How is your site going to scale? Do you have an e-commerce platform that allows for adding multiple countries, or do you need to start thinking about that? And then fulfillment needs to be local at this point. So either FBA or partially FBA, and also your own fulfillment. And that's why I point at B2C Europe, who are upstairs, that they're one of the providers who can help you provide local logistics. All right, so since no one reads anything online anymore if it's not a numbered list, because that's how we communicate, here are the 10 things to think about. This is my recap. And these are kind of the pointers that I point out. So in terms of returns, maybe you can do a refund or do a partial refund and avoid the actual return if possible. Think about tracking your packages to make sure that they actually get to where they were intended to go. And if they don't, at least you can prove that it wasn't your fault. Fraud is going to be a problem as you start moving globally, so think about how you're going to deal with that, and if you suspect fraud, just ask. For tax, all those issues, get help early. It's very important that you get that right from the start, because you don't want HMRC knocking on the door. Starting with passive CBT is going to give you a lot of good data, so make sure that you have access to that, obviously, and that you learn from the passive CBT when you start to expand internationally. Get help with translations. Unless you're a French native going into France, you're going to need professional help. So outsource. Make sure to verify. Make sure you get all your costs into your pricing abroad, so that you don't end up selling at a loss without even realizing it. So think about what are the additional costs you are incurring from this. Look for marketplaces that do CBT for you. So I listed a few. Scott alluded to Lazada that does Southeast Asia. They also provide a lot of services to help you get onto the marketplace easily. make sure that, and this again goes to the customer service, respond quickly, make sure that you maintain a good seller rating on these foreign marketplaces as well. And finally, as you start to move into having a local presence, think about your logistics, how you're going to do your fulfillment, what products are going onto FBA, which ones are you going to do with your own logistics solution. With 2 minutes to spare or something like that, I think. So, all right. Thank you very much. This is where I think there's someone with a microphone in the back if someone has any questions. I may even have answers. We'll see. Anyone? Go ahead.
What's the overall success of the eBay trials and the translation?
Varied, I would say. We learned a lot, and the sellers learned a lot in terms of what works. Some of them, we had sellers that did as much on the IAP program as they do totally in the UK. So they like doubled their business thanks to IAP. And we had some where it was a nice add-on, but not significant. And I think it depends drastically on your products. Is anyone from Something Different here? No. One of the favorite stories was, I don't know if you've seen the 3 Wolf Moon t-shirts. They were a meme on Amazon about a year ago. And so when we first started launching the first sellers and we looked at the stats, and there was this one seller, Something Different, that just blew it out. And so we went in to look at what they sold. And they do like t-shirts with wolf prints on them. And apparently Germans love that stuff. So like anything you have with a wolf on it, send it to Germany. But point of that is it depends a lot on what kind of products you have. And we saw a lot of sellers that used it as kind of the first step of the iteration. So they put their 500 up. Based on that, we have one electronic seller that put 500 up in 4 countries, analyzed the numbers, and then translated another 50,000. So that was their first iteration, and so it's tremendously useful for them to get that data. What else? No one. All right, I think we're safe. Thank you very much. And I'll obviously be around, so grab me if you have any questions. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.